All right, Sports Bash Live Football at 4. Geoff Mosher's in today for today's Football at 4. We'll bring him into the conversation in just a second as we get ready for another edition of Football at 4 here, powered by InsideTheBirds.com. Moshe, what's up, man?
Hey, I'm not sure. Is this the right line or am I on Zoom?
You are on the right line.
You are on the air.
You are on the air live on 97.3 ESPN.
All right, good, because I was on 2 different channels at once, and that was weird.
Yeah.
How you guys doing?
All right. No, we're doing good, man. Good conversation. A lot of Carson Wentz talk throughout the show. That we've had some good conversation, good text messages, but a lot to get into today. I know, you wrote an article for InsideTheBirds.com regarding the potential end of the running back by committee of the Doug Peterson era. Are we really ready to see one guy take over and be the man?
Well, I think we are, and I don't see why anything would be different with Miles Sanders, who was a second-round pick, who had over 1,300 offensive yards last year as a rookie, than any other highly drafted pick in, say, the last 20 years of mostly Andy Reid coaching the franchise. We know Doug comes from the Andy Reid tree. Andy, you go back and you find Deuce Staley and Brian Westbrook, and then eventually Shady McCoy. And then when Andy went to Kansas City, he turned Jamal Charles, who was already a very good running back, into an ultimate weapon. Ultimately, the injuries did Jamal in. And then he found Kareem Hunt and was about to do the same until Kareem Hunt had off-field issues. So one thing I addressed in the story, guys, is that because the Eagles really haven't had that type of weapon for the first 3 years of Doug's coaching tenure in Philadelphia, and he's had to use the carousel or the committee approach, I think people have mistakenly believed that Doug Peterson prefers this style instead of looking at it as, well, that's just the hand that he's been continuously dealt up until last year when he got Miles Sanders. And even last year, Miles had to be integrated into the offense. He couldn't just make him the feature back right away, especially since they had brought in Jordan Howard, who had done well in sharing carries with Miles. But I think because Doug tends to stand at the podium and say, oh, well, yeah, I like the committee because that's what he has, and he's not going to sit there and say, I don't like my committee when those are guys he's coaching. People have assumed that he's a RBBC type guy, but that wouldn't make any sense. And you have a guy like Miles Sanders who has the potential to be just like those running backs that I mentioned. To me, it's obvious that they're going to use him in that way, and it's not going to be the committee approach.
Yeah, the one question is, you go back to that 2017 year when they had Blunt, Ajayi, Corey Clement, and when they got Jay Ajayi, you remember, Geoff, most people were like, all right, they got him to be that guy. And I guess that's why some people felt maybe he doesn't want to use one guy because that they felt that Ajayi was clearly the best of the three, and maybe that's not the case. Maybe Blunt was equal to him, or that's the way Peterson saw it. But you remember that conversation, I'm sure, where when they got Jay Ajayi, it was like, all right, when is he going to kind of take over? And he never really did.
Right, he never did. I honestly think when they acquired him, they knew about the medicals, they knew about the bone-on-bone in the knee going back to Boise State. He was still a very good running back, and it was somebody who could bolster their position and strengthen them, and they needed it. And I think he is when healthy, he was a better all-around weapon than LeGarrette Blount. But I also knew, when they acquired him, he had 2 years left. It was a 5th-round pick, so it was a steal of a deal. I'm not sure they envisioned him, because of the injury history and because of the type of running back that he is or was, as the kind of guy that they were going to go forward with for 5, 6, 7 years. I think that they knew that the injuries were always going to make him the type of guy you would want if you had a rotation or a committee. He might get more carries, the most out of the committee, but I don't think they ever envisioned him as the kind of guy who was going to be a franchise 3-down back for 6, 7, 8 years.
If they don't acquire anyone else, or if Sanders does go down, do you think that there is a possibility of a mid-season trade similar to the whole Jay Ajayi situation?
Well, I think, Hunter, that they probably will still look to bring in a veteran. It's just that they're obviously taking their time. They're not rushed into it. Devontae Freeman's out there, and maybe if Devontae's price tag comes down and he comes back to earth a little bit, he would be, I think, a really good backup. People talk about him never staying healthy. But I say, well, that's why he'd be a good backup with measured snaps. You're not playing him full time. But if that doesn't work out, Hunter, there's always a wave of running backs, pretty decent ones, that are released right around the cut down date, who could probably come into the Eagles and pick up the language really quickly. They may have played in the West Coast offense before. There's just always 5 or 6 guys that fit that mold that the Eagles could pick up, even before the idea that Miles Sanders would get hurt. So I do expect them to make a move there. If not, then it just goes and validates everything I said, which is that their inaction at really putting a number 2 in this group who's a veteran, who's proven, and who could play a couple of games if Miles were to get hurt. Their inaction just shows you that they really believe Miles is the man and that they're ready to go forward with him the way they've done in the past with Shady and Westbrook and the others.
Yeah, which is I think the one area where it makes sense is if Sanders got hurt, because what if Sanders got hurt? Boston Scott, Elijah Holyfield, Corey Clement, others that are going to be in camp, are any of those guys equipped to kind of be that guy, or do you kind of go back to running back by committee?
Right. Yeah, I don't want to sit here and say that none of those guys could, but the reality is we don't know. We've seen Boston Scott last year kind of step into that at the end of the season when Miles did get hurt, and there was a game, I think, against the Giants where Boston had double-digit carries and a bunch of catches, and he wound up having over 100 all-purpose yards. And so he looked like someone who could potentially step into that number 2 role and have good games and move the chains and be productive. But the problem is we don't know if he could do that over a 4 or 5 or a 6 game stretch if he ever had to. Obviously he's a very short guy. He seems more, and again, I hate to typecast, but he does seem like more the type to be that change up Darren Sproles number 3 curveball type of back than a number 2 who could be a number 1 for a prolonged stretch. Same thing with Corey Clement, who just has not stayed healthy for the last 2 years. I mean, if you told me Corey Clement was going to be healthy all year long, I'd feel pretty confident that he could be that kind of number 2 back, because we saw his rapid development as a rookie to the point where he's one of the Super Bowl heroes, 100 yards receiving in that game. Elijah Holyfield, we have to see. We just don't know the answer to that. And same thing with the rookie free agents that they really like and they feel have potential, but those guys have a lot to learn and not a lot of time to learn it.
I just feel you can always find someone to run the football. I mean, remember Josh Adams, Corey Clement, Boston Scott is even one of those guys. Like, you can always find someone to run the ball, I feel. And I'm not saying that it's not important to make sure you find another piece or you find that veteran, but I don't know if it should be as stressful as maybe some people think it is.
Well, it's a double-edged sword. I agree with you. You can always find a guy to move the chains. And Josh Adams, if you remember a couple of years ago, had some spurts where he was really moving the chains and doing a nice job. He had a few runs of over 30 or 40 yards, but he also had some real problems, right? Surprisingly for a guy as big as he is, in short yardage. I believe the stat was he was 0-7 on conversions of 3rd or 4th and 1. And he obviously had his issues in pass protection. And if you go back and look at the stretch of games that he played a lot, I don't think the Eagles had a winning record in that game. So while you can always find somebody who's productive, are you finding someone who's also helping you in the other areas that sometimes go unnoticed, or is he costing you in those areas? And clearly you go back to Josh Adams and you say, well, you know what? He helped in some areas, but he also hurt in some others. So I do think the Eagles would be smart to try to scour that waiver wire at the end of training camp, or maybe even possibly before, to pick up a veteran or someone that they feel comfortable with to be a number 2. But again, that won't change the fact that right now Miles Sanders is their view of a franchise back.
It's interesting. What does it say about, a guy like Josh Adams, who was your leading rusher one year and can't get a job, like how that position is viewed and valued in the league?
Yeah, you said it. I mean, like you could just like Corey Clement, he was a rookie free agent in 2017, and he wound up making enough strides to be a major contributor, not just in the Super Bowl, but down the stretch, to be that 3rd back behind Blunt and Ajayi. I mean, he really served an important role, and they found him, as a rookie free agent. So you can find these guys. It doesn't mean that just because you can find it's almost like this. You can find a lot of guys who can get a job done, but you can't always find the guys who can just be elite at that position very easily. And though that's why there's a difference between what you're going to get from Miles Sanders and what you might get from Josh Adams, and then also how they're viewed a year later.
Geoff Mosher, Football at 4, powered by InsideTheBirds.com. Of course, we're looking at the Eagles in the NFL. I want to ask you a couple of questions regarding this wide receiving core here. When we take a look at Carson Wentz was out there throwing around finally down in Houston with Rieger, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, Marquise Goodwin, I think it was reported, was down there as well. What do you think about the depth chart and the positions for this receiver group? You know, I think everybody acknowledges Deshaun Jackson, but what's the rest of the depth chart kind of look like, and where do they kind of situate themselves? How do you see these receivers kind of situated on the field?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I hate to borrow a Chip Kellyism, but, you know, Chip used to say the depth chart is written in sand, right? And I do think that when you look at this wide receiver core, you can pretty much say the same thing. In fact, Adam Kaplan and I really hit this subject hard in the last Inside the Birds podcast, where we talked about depth being a concern at wide receiver. And you say, well, what do you mean depth is a concern? They drafted 3 wide receivers. They traded for Goodwin and got Deshaun coming back. Well, yeah, but, you know, if you look at the collection of wide receivers, the only one that's ever really proven anything is Deshaun. So as much as I like Jalen Reagor and people around the league like his explosion, he's obviously going to be behind the 8 ball like every rookie. So you got to hope that he's up to speed and can catch on quickly. J.J. Arcega-Whiteside was a second-round pick who really struggled as a rookie, and he's not like a lot of those first-year players also not having that opportunity right now to show that year 1 to year 2 jump. And he can really only play one spot, and that's the X. And so if he doesn't really show the strides that you were hoping for him to show, then you've got to kind of force-feed Jalen Reagor at the X and hope he's ready. And if neither of those guys are going to get the job done, well, yeah, you have Marquise Goodwin, who's got a lot of speed, but has not really stayed healthy and durable throughout his career and is also learning a new offense. And then, of course, the rookies, John Hightower and Quez Watkins, are what they are. They're rookies who are a 5th and 6th round pick, and so they've got to make the team first. So while there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm about this reshaped wide receiver group that's predicated on speed now, there's a whole lot of – there's as many questions, I think, as there are answers.
Do you think that Greg Ward can actually improve and take another step in his career, or is it more of he is what he is and this is what you're going to get, a steady slot guy?
I think he can improve, Hunter, and that's a good question because I left him out. He definitely can improve because he's a young player, and young players can always get better at doing certain things, route running, reading defenses, stacking corners with technique and as in a certain way because they learn. You know, Jason Avant is a guy who I thought was an excellent slot receiver who seemed to get better every year. But at the same time, Jason was never going to be a 1,000-yard receiver. He was never going to have 10 touchdowns. He was always going to be that complementary interior receiver who benefited from the space eaten up by Deshaun and Jeremy Maclin, right? So with Greg Ward, I think he can improve just because he's young and ascending, but I would say he's not going to – I can't imagine him being a guy who's ever going to be your number 1 and probably never even be your number 2 wide receiver unless you have a very depleted wide receiver core like they had at the end of last year. But I do think, to answer your question more specifically for this year, he's got a pretty good opportunity to be that slot receiver in 11 personnel because – who's going to play the slot right now? I mean, they want Reagor to play slot at some times and be a move receiver, but again, it goes back to how much are they going to be able to put on Jalen Reagor's plate without a whole lot of mini camps, and we'll see what happens with training camp. So when they're in 11 personnel on day 1, of training camp, and you've got Deshaun at the Z and probably Reagor at the X or maybe Arcega-Whiteside at the X, then your slot receiver in those formations is going to be Greg Ward. And it'll be up to the other guys to outplay him and show that they can be counted on to play inside in the slot.
Right. Well, okay, so if you were to say Jackson's your number 1 receiver, I don't even know who you would answer to be your number 2 receiver. It almost seems that Ward would be your number 3 receiver. So I guess my question is he in any competition? In other words, if J.J. Arcega-Whiteside comes back and he's much improved and you want to get Jalen Reagor on the field, does Jalen move to the slot? What about some of these other guys like Marquise Goodwin, John Hightower? And, does Greg Ward, in your opinion, have that slot position kind of nailed down as your number 3 receiver, and everybody else is battling out to be the number 2, 4, 5, and maybe 6?
Yeah, I have a hard time believing that Greg Ward's not going to make the team. I mean, he's going to give you value on special teams. He does have the ability to throw the ball, which we didn't see last year because he was a quarterback at Houston. Might see it this year because he's been experienced with the offense and because their receiver core is in better shape. But at the same time, while he has a spot very much so probably locked down because of his experience and what he showed last year, he does stand to lose the most if the young kids and the new additions really play well. Because if Jalen Reagor is, they want to move him around. They want him to play the X. They want him to play the slot at times and capitalize on his explosion in space, which Greg Ward doesn't have. So in your scenario, Arcega-Whiteside's playing well. Well, then you put Arcega-Whiteside at the X, you keep Deshaun at the Z, and you'll put Jalen in the slot for those 11 personnel formations just to give yourself a little bit more explosion. And then obviously Greg would have to come off the field. But again, we're far from that, and that's only incumbent upon those guys I mentioned outplaying Greg Ward and proving that they need to be on the field.
Mosher's here for Football at 4, powered by Inside the Bird. So, yeah, how important is that number 3 receiver when you got Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, too? So that kind of pushes the third wide receiver off the field a lot, I would imagine, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, look at they played more 12 personnel last year than I think any other team. And I always have the number in front of me, but now I don't. I forget how much 12 personnel it was. But it's not like it's 80-20. It's usually something like 55-45. So you're still in 11 personnel, a decent amount. You're still going to have a lot of 3rd and 5, 3rd and 6, 3rd and 8, where you're going to want more speed on the field and be in that 3 receiver formation. But to your point, we've seen injuries hurt the Eagles at other positions, not really tight end, although Dallas Goedert had nursed a calf injury last year, but they're really just one tight end injury away from having to play more 11 personnel than they're accustomed to.
The other day, Gil and I got into the top 50 Pro Football Focus list, and 3 Eagles made it. It was Fletcher Cox, Brandon Brooks, and Brandon Graham. Do you think that maybe Carson Wentz, Darius Slay should be in the conversation of maybe making that top 50 list, and even though they didn't?
It's tough for me to say without seeing who the other 47 players are and how. I know we talked about this and how they do it, their grading. Their grading is position unspecific, right? They just find a bunch of traits, grade them, and give it to the highest grade. So I don't know how many quarterbacks made their top 50. Clearly
6. It was 6. Deshaun Watson was the last quarterback on that list. So that's kind of where I was thinking, maybe Wentz could have slid in. He didn't even make the top 60 because they did the final 10 that didn't make the cut.
To be fair, Wentz I don't think Aaron Rodgers was in the top 50 either.
He was not. Aaron Rodgers and Wentz were the 2 quarterbacks that were up for debate.
You guys remember that day that Aaron Rodgers threw 5 touchdown passes and got a negative grade by PFF? It was like 5 or 6 years ago. And he got like a minus 7.5 or something like that, even though he threw 5 touchdowns. So I like to joke about, how we treat sometimes PFF as gospel when it's a little bit crazy. But I'll say for their rankings, it's all based on their formula and the numbers. It's not opinion. It's not like they felt that Deshaun Watson to the eye is more pleasing than Carson Wentz. It's literally a breakdown of all the traits and how they grade it out. So it's easy to do a ranking when you're just doing it by a numerical formula that you came up with that eliminates subjectivity. So I don't really have a problem with their methods and what they do, and it does create interesting discussion. I guess I'd be curious to see what Deshaun Watson's overall score was compared to Carson's and where he might have graded higher in certain traits that they break down for quarterbacks.
Real quick, I want to go back to that receiving room and get your opinion on this because we've mentioned, Deshaun number 1, not sure who's number 2, Ward number 3, and then you have everything up for grabs. Do you think both Hightower, Watkins, Are they fighting with each other? Who are they in a battle with? I mean, do they want to keep both of those guys? Is it really one or the other? I mean, I think that's another interesting kind of thing that will start to shape out.
Well, that's do they want to keep Hightower and Watkins? Yes, because that means that they played so well that they couldn't keep these two guys off the 53 man, and that's a great situation and scenario. We're far from that. So I think more realistically, I don't even know who's the number one receiver. Deshaun's the most proven receiver, but I'm not sure he's going to be the most targeted receiver, especially at this stage in his career. So it raises a good question about number. Obviously, the number one receiver is Zach Ertz, right? Because he's the number one pass catching target. But Deshaun's going to be there. Rager is definitely going to be there. I think Ward is as good a shot at any to make there. So that's 3 right there. Arcega-Whiteside, I imagine he's going to be on the team unless he absolutely completely falls on his face, which we'll see. I doubt it. So that's 4 right there. Goodwin should probably make the team unless he, again, falls on his face and gets outplayed by both Watkins and Hightower. But if you're asking me to handicap it right now, I would say Deshaun, Rager, Ward, Arcega-Whiteside, Goodwin, and one of the rookies, probably Hightower.
All right, Football 4, Geoff Mosher's here, powered by InsideTheBirds.com. The possibility has come up, Jeff, that there could be just 2 preseason games this year, and I guess that would be to give teams more training camp time or safety reasons, to keep people out of play in stadiums, but maybe this is the precursor of cutting back those preseason games.
Well, yeah, we know that the NFL has been trying to eliminate those preseason games anyway. We know there's been discussions about the extra, the 17th game that's going to be coming and then 18 in a couple of years. So they're headed down this path, and they have been for a while. Why I think it's more relevant and pertinent this year, and I assume that if they only do 2 preseason games this year, they push the dates of game 1 and game 2 back. Like, you know what I'm saying? Normally, you play your first preseason game like 2.5 weeks before you report, I believe, that 3rd week of training camp. And it wouldn't surprise me if you're not playing that first preseason game, the first of 2, until 4 or 5 weeks into the training camp preseason. Because as we've talked about, going back a couple of weeks now, you can't just have a normal training camp. You can't have guys report and then by day 4 or day 5, you're in pads doing everything. You almost have to treat your first 2 or 3 weeks of training camp like an OTA. You've got to teach. You got a lot of rookies and newcomers and first-year players or second-year players trying to improve from their rookie year who need to learn a whole lot. And so I feel like the first 2 or 3 weeks of training camp is going to be more like an OTA where there's more instruction and less, all right, let's just get on the field and start our practicing. And so by making just 2 preseason games and pushing that first preseason game back down, closer to later August, you allow for a longer instructional and ramp up period into real practices, and that also will help you prevent injuries.
What's funny, because we've been saying we don't need these preseason games, they don't matter. Let's see what happens in early August when we don't have those 2 games to kind of be like, hey, this guy looked all right. And then all of a sudden you're like, man, I really missed those preseason games.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to certainly take away from our discussions, right? Because we all like to put a lot into preseason games, or we also like to take preseason games and something bad will happen and be like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So it'll be a little bit more mundane.
No, I really need to see the offense go down and give me a good drive before they take them out of the game.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. I mean, you remember the Sam Bradford years and all the hubbub that was made over his performances against Green Bay and Baltimore. You would have thought Joe Montana, in his prime was coming to quarterback the Eagles.
Football 4, powered by Inside the Birds. Geoff Mosher at Geoff Mosher NFL. And, of course, like all guys appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. Tomorrow, Adam Kaplan is in from Football at 4. Friday, it is Andrew DeCecco. Jeffrey, we'll talk to you Monday, pal.
It's been a pleasure, guys. Have a great rest of the weekend.
That went by quick. And good stuff on the Eagles running backs, the wide receivers. We'll continue to look at the depth chart of them throughout this offseason.